The crack of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Silver Creek as Jackson Thornton galloped in on his exhausted stallion, his gaze hard and unflinching beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. The year was 1878, and the West was still wild enough to swallow a man whole if he showed any sign of weakness. Jackson dismounted with practiced ease, his spurs jingling against the packed dirt as he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the town's only saloon. His reputation preceded him, the gunslinger who'd lost his heart along with his wife 5 years prior, leaving nothing but a hollow shell and deadly aim. The townsfolk called him Stone Heart behind his back, but never to his face. No one dared. "Water for the horse," he told the stable boy who approached cautiously. Jackson flipped the boy a coin without making eye contact and pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. The usual symphony of clinking glasses, drunken laughter, and out-of-tune piano playing faltered momentarily as patrons registered the newcomer. Jackson paid them no mind, making his way to the bar where he ordered whiskey with a voice rough from disuse. "You're a long way from Kansas, Thornton," remarked the bartender, sliding a glass across the polished wood. Jackson downed the amber liquid in one swallow. "Just passing through, need work. Sheriff might have something. Town's been having trouble with the Clayton gang raiding supply wagons." The bartender refilled Jackson's glass. "They hit another one yesterday. Lady schoolteacher nearly got killed." Jackson nodded absently, uninterested in local problems. He'd learned long ago that getting involved only led to pain. 5 years since Emily's death had taught him that much. He was here for work, money, and then he'd move on as always. The saloon doors swung open again, and Jackson's attention was drawn to the newcomer not by choice, but by the sudden quiet that fell over the room. A woman stood in the doorway, her posture straight and determined. She wasn't dressed like the saloon girls. Her deep blue dress was modest but well-fitted, and her honey-brown hair was pulled back in a simple style that emphasized high cheekbones and clear eyes. "Mr. Dawson," she called to the bartender, her voice melodic but firm. "I need to speak with you about tomorrow's town meeting." Jackson turned back to his drink, uninterested in town politics. He was planning his next destination when a commotion erupted near the door. 3 men had entered, their clothes dusty from the trail, guns prominently displayed on their hips. "Well, if it ain't the pretty schoolteacher," drawled the tallest of the 3, his voice slurring with alcohol. "Miss Vivian Harper, ain't you got no sense coming into a place like this?" Jackson watched from the corner of his eye as the woman Vivian straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Clayton, I believe you and your brothers have an appointment with the sheriff. After what happened to my supply wagon, he's quite eager to speak with you." Clayton laughed, a harsh sound that grated on Jackson's ears. "That wagon was fair game, Teach. This is Clayton territory now." "This is Silver Creek, and it belongs to its people," Vivian replied, her voice unwavering despite the dangerous situation developing around her. Jackson sighed into his glass. Getting involved wasn't his intention, but when Clayton reached for Vivian's arm, something instinctive made him move. In one fluid motion, he was between them, his hand gripping Clayton's wrist with enough force to make the man wince. "The lady doesn't want to be touched," Jackson said quietly, though every person in the now silent saloon heard him clearly. Clayton's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be, stranger?" "Someone passing through," Jackson replied, releasing Clayton's wrist with a small shove. "Someone suggesting you find another form of entertainment." The standoff lasted only seconds, but Jackson knew the type well enough: bullies who backed down when faced with a real threat. Clayton spat on the floor near Jackson's boots. "This ain't over," he muttered, gesturing to his brothers. "Come on, boys, we'll finish our business later." As they left, the saloon gradually returned to life. Jackson turned to go back to his drink but found himself looking into Vivian Harper's clear blue eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Though I was handling it," Jackson nodded once. "Sure looked like it." A smile flickered across her face. "You must be new to Silver Creek." "I'm Vivian Harper, the schoolteacher." "Jackson Thornton." He offered nothing more, hoping she'd take the hint and leave him to his solitude. Instead, she studied him with a gaze so direct it made him uncomfortable. "You've handled men like Clayton before." It wasn't a question, so Jackson didn't answer. He returned to the bar, but to his mild annoyance she followed. "Mr. Dawson," she addressed the bartender again, "about that meeting, yes, Miss Harper, noon tomorrow at the church. Everyone's been notified." "Good. We need to discuss the school and these raids." She glanced at Jackson. "Perhaps Mr. Thornton might attend as well. We could use someone with his skills." Jackson shook his head. "I'm just passing through, madam." "That's unfortunate," she replied, gathering her small handbag. "Silver Creek could use a man willing to stand up to the Claytons." She nodded politely. "Good evening, gentlemen." Jackson watched her leave, noting the respectful nods she received from even the roughest men in the saloon. Curious, he turned to the bartender. "Schoolteacher has a lot of pull around here," Dawson chuckled. "Miss Harper's been here 3 years. Started the school, organized relief when the drought hit last summer, tends to the sick when Doc's overwhelmed. Lady's got spine and heart in equal measure." He lowered his voice. "Lost her fiancé in the war, came west to start fresh. Never shows her grief, but folks say she works so hard she doesn't have time to feel it." Jackson grunted, uninterested in her story. Everyone had losses. He finished his drink and arranged for a room, determined to speak with the sheriff in the morning and be on his way by nightfall. Sleep eluded him that night. His room above the saloon was comfortable enough, but his mind kept returning to Vivian Harper's direct gaze and the quiet strength in her voice. She reminded him of Emily not in looks, but in that core of steel beneath a gentle exterior. The comparison made his chest ache with a pain he thought he'd buried years ago. Dawn found him already dressed and standing at his window, watching the town come to life. Silver Creek was larger than many settlements he'd passed through, with proper buildings instead of hastily constructed shanties. Signs of civilization and permanence that Jackson had avoided for years. At the sheriff's office, he found a harried man in his 50s with a silver-streaked beard and tired eyes. "Jackson Thornton," the sheriff said, recognition flashing across his face. "Your reputation precedes you." "Looking for work," Jackson said simply. Timing couldn't be better. "These Clayton boys are stirring up real trouble. Started with cattle rustling, moved on to robbing supply wagons. Yesterday they shot up the schoolteacher's wagon supplies for the children, books and such, nearly killed her." The sheriff ran a hand over his face. "I'm short-handed. Deputies down with fever, and I've got 3 prisoners to transport to the territorial court next week." Jackson listened as the sheriff outlined what he needed: protection for the town's next supply wagon, due in 3 days, and possibly help tracking the Claytons to their hideout. The pay was fair and the job straightforward. "I'll take it," Jackson said finally. 3 days, then I move on." "Fair enough. Town meetings at noon if you want to hear what folks are saying. Miss Harper's organizing it." Jackson had no intention of attending any meeting, but as noon approached, he found himself wandering toward the white clapboard church on the edge of town. He told himself it was to gather information about the Claytons, nothing more. The church was filled with townspeople when he slipped in, taking a position at the back where he could observe without participating. Vivian Harper stood at the front, addressing the gathering with the confidence of someone used to commanding a classroom. "The raids must stop," she was saying. "Our children need those supplies. Mr. Peterson has offered to drive the next wagon, but after yesterday's attack, we need protection." "Clayton and his boys are getting bolder," someone called out. "They shot at you, Miss Harper." Jackson saw her slight flinch, quickly controlled. "Yes, well, they missed. The point is we need help," interrupted an older man who Jackson recognized as the town doctor. "Sheriff can't do it alone, and most of us are farmers, not gunmen." "I've hired help," the sheriff announced from his position near the front. "Jackson Thornton arrived yesterday. He'll be guarding the next supply wagon." All eyes turned to the back of the room, finding Jackson leaning against the wall. He cursed inwardly at the attention Vivian's gaze locked with his. "Mr. Thornton, I'm glad you decided to help us after all." He gave a curt nod, uncomfortable with the scrutiny of the entire town. The meeting continued, with discussions about fundraising for more supplies and organizing a town patrol. Jackson remained silent, observing the dynamics. Vivian clearly held influence here, but it was earned through respect rather than fear. People listened when she spoke, and her suggestions were practical, focused on the community's needs rather than her own. When the meeting concluded, Jackson tried to slip away, but Vivian caught up to him outside the church. "Thank you for coming," she said, "and for agreeing to help with the wagon." "It's just a job," he replied. "To you, perhaps, to us, it's our future." "Those books and supplies mean everything to my students." She hesitated. "Would you like to see the school? It might help to understand what you're protecting." Jackson nearly refused, but something in her expression stopped him. It wasn't manipulation or flirtation, just an honest desire to show him the importance of what they were fighting for. "Lead the way," he found himself saying. The schoolhouse was a simple building at the far end of town, freshly painted white with a small bell tower. Inside, rows of desks faced a larger desk and blackboard. Shelves lined the walls, half filled with books. "It's not much," Vivian said, running her hand along one of the student desks. "But we've built it together. Every book, every slate was hard-won." Jackson moved around the room, noting the carefully mended maps on the wall and the stack of readers on Vivian's desk. "How many students?" 28 now, ages 6 to 16. Pride colored her voice. "Some ride in from 5 miles away. James Whitaker, he's 12, gets up at 4 every morning to help with chores before riding in. Says he's going to be a doctor someday." Despite himself, Jackson was impressed. "And the supplies that were lost," her expression clouded. "Books mostly. Paper, ink, slates. I'd saved for months to order them." She straightened. "But we'll manage, we always do." "The Claytons. What's their grievance with the town?" "Greed, mostly. Their father owned the largest ranch in the territory until he gambled it away 5 years ago. The sons believe Silver Creek somehow cheated them of their inheritance." She shook her head. "Roy Clayton, the one you met, he courted me when I first arrived. When I declined his proposal, his resentment toward the town seemed to grow." Jackson processed this information. Personal vendetta complicated matters, made men unpredictable. "How many in their gang?" "The 3 brothers and perhaps 5 or 6 hired guns. They camp in the hills north of town, but no one knows exactly where." Jackson nodded, formulating a plan. He'd need to scout the terrain before the wagon arrived. "I'll handle it." "I know you will," Vivian said with such certainty that it caught him off guard. "Sheriff Parker says you're the best." Jackson moved toward the door, uncomfortable with her faith in him. "Don't believe everything you hear, Miss Harper." "I believe what I see," she replied. "And yesterday I saw a man who didn't hesitate to help a stranger." She walked him to the door. "Will you join us for supper tonight, Mrs. Wilson?" "I board with her, always cooks too much, and she'd welcome the company." Jackson opened his mouth to refuse, then found himself saying, "What time?" 6 o'clock. The blue house with the picket fence, 3 doors down from the general store. As he walked away, Jackson wondered what had possessed him to accept. Socializing wasn't part of the job, and getting to know the townspeople only made leaving harder. Yet something about Vivian Harper's direct gaze and quiet determination intrigued him, pushing past defenses he'd maintained for years. That evening, Jackson arrived at the Wilson home precisely at 6, his hair still damp from washing, wearing the cleanest shirt he possessed. Mrs. Wilson, a cheerful widow in her 60s, welcomed him with enthusiasm that suggested visitors were a rare treat. "Miss Harper's just helping Sally with her reading," she explained, leading him to a small but comfortable parlor. "They'll be down shortly. May I offer you some coffee, Mr. Thornton?" Jackson accepted politely, taking in the modest but well-kept home. Photographs adorned the walls, family portraits and landscapes. A small, upright piano stood in one corner, sheet music neatly stacked atop it. "You play?" he asked when Mrs. Wilson returned with coffee. Oh, heavens no. That's Miss Harper's instrument. Such beautiful music she makes, though only when she thinks no one's listening. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. Sad songs, mostly. I think she misses her home back east sometimes, though she'd never admit it. Before Jackson could respond, footsteps on the stairs announced Vivian's arrival. She entered with a young girl of about 10, who regarded Jackson with undisguised curiosity. Mr. Thornton, this is Sally Wilson, my landlady's granddaughter and one of my best students, Vivian introduced them. The girl curtsied politely. Are you really going to shoot the bad men who took our books, Sally? Mrs. Wilson exclaimed, horrified. Jackson couldn't help a small smile. I'm going to make sure your new books arrive safely. Sally seemed satisfied with this answer and was soon sent to wash up for dinner. The meal that followed was simple but delicious roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread. Jackson found himself drawn into conversation about the town's history, the challenges of ranching in the territory, and the recent drought that had nearly devastated the region. Miss Harper organized a water brigade, Mrs. Wilson explained proudly. Had the older students help carry water from the creek to the gardens, saved half the town's vegetables. It was a community effort, Vivian demurred. Everyone did their part. Jackson watched her as she deflected praise, noting how she redirected conversation to others' accomplishments. It was a kind of modesty he rarely encountered in his travels. After dinner, Sally begged Vivian to play the piano. She declined at first, but the girl's persistence wore her down. Just one song, Vivian agreed finally, moving to the instrument. Jackson expected a simple tune, perhaps a hymn or folk song. Instead, her fingers touched the keys with surprising skill, drawing forth a melody so poignant it seemed to fill the small room with unspoken emotion. It wasn't a piece he recognized, but its melancholy beauty stirred something long dormant within him. When she finished, the room remained silent for a moment. Sally clapped enthusiastically, breaking the spell, but Jackson found himself unable to look away from Vivian's profile as she closed the piano lid. That was Chopin, she explained, noticing his gaze. My mother taught me. It was beautiful, he said simply. The evening concluded soon after, with Sally being sent to bed and Mrs. Wilson tactfully retiring to her room with some mending. Jackson found himself alone with Vivian on the small front porch, the night air cool and fragrant with the scent of Mrs. Wilson's roses. Thank you for coming, Vivian said, breaking the comfortable silence. It's good for Sally to see that there are still gentlemen in the world. Her father abandoned the family last year. I'm no gentleman, Jackson replied, his voice gruff. Just doing a job. Vivian studied him in the lamplight spilling from the window. You sell yourself short, Mr. Thornton. I've met many men who claim to be gentlemen but would never have stood up to Roy Clayton as you did. Jackson shifted uncomfortably. Miss Harper, Vivian, please. Vivian, he amended, I think you might be confusing manners with morals. I've done things I'm not proud of. Haven't we all? She leaned against the porch railing. The past shapes us, Mr. Thornton, but it doesn't define us. At least that's what I tell my students. Jackson wondered what this educated, refined woman had experienced to bring her to a frontier town like Silver Creek. The question must have shown on his face. I came west after losing my fiancé at Gettysburg, she said quietly. Teaching seemed the only thing that made sense anymore. These children, they need someone who believes in them. And who believes in you? The question slipped out before he could stop it. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I manage. We all do what we must. The parallel to his own solitary existence struck Jackson forcefully. He'd wandered for 5 years, taking dangerous jobs, avoiding connections. Vivian had chosen a different path, building a community around her, pouring her grief into something constructive. I should go, he said, suddenly needing distance from these uncomfortable reflections. Need to scout the terrain tomorrow before the wagon arrives. Of course. She extended her hand. Thank you again, Mr. Thornton. Jackson, he corrected, taking her hand briefly. Her skin was soft, but he could feel calluses, the marks of someone who worked alongside her elegant piano playing. Jackson, she repeated with a small smile. Be careful tomorrow, the Claytons know these hills better than most. He nodded and stepped off the porch, feeling her gaze follow him down the street. Something about Vivian Harper had gotten under his skin, and Jackson wasn't sure he liked it. Attachment was dangerous in his line of work, a distraction he couldn't afford. Dawn found him riding north of town, following the supply route the wagon would take in 2 days' time. The terrain was varied open grassland giving way to rocky foothills with numerous places for ambush. Jackson took mental notes of each potential danger spot, planning defenses and alternate routes. By midday, he'd climbed high enough to see the valley spread out below him. Silver Creek, a neat collection of buildings bisected by the glinting ribbon of water that gave the town its name. From this vantage point, he also spotted what he was looking for: a thin column of smoke rising from a sheltered canyon about 3 miles northeast of his position. Jackson approached cautiously, leaving his horse tethered in a stand of cottonwoods and proceeding on foot. The Clayton camp was well situated, a natural box canyon with only one narrow entrance, easily defended. He counted 8 men and a woman around a campfire, with several tents and a crude lean-to stable for their horses. Roy Clayton's voice carried clearly in the still air as Jackson watched from behind a boulder. The wagon's coming day after tomorrow. Frank saw them loading it in Junction City. What about that gunslinger? One of the men asked. Heard he's riding shotgun. Clayton spat into the fire. 1 man. Against all of us, don't matter who he is. I heard he's Jackson Thornton, another voice cautioned. They say he killed 12 men in that business down in Abilene. Stories, Clayton dismissed. We hit fast, take what we want, and disappear. By the time they organize a posse, we'll be long gone. Jackson had heard enough. He retreated silently, making his way back to his horse. The Claytons were confident, which made them dangerous but also potentially careless. He had the beginnings of a plan forming as he rode back to Silver Creek. The sheriff was waiting for him at the stable. Find anything? Jackson nodded, dismounting. Their camp. 8 men, maybe 9, they know about the wagon. He outlined what he'd overheard and his proposed countermeasures. That might work, the sheriff said thoughtfully, but it's risky. Less risky than a direct confrontation with those odds, Jackson replied. I'll need 3 men who can ride and shoot, not heroes, just steady hands. I can give you 2 deputies from the next county over. They're arriving tonight to help with my prisoner transport. For the 3rd. The sheriff hesitated. Would you consider taking Peterson? He's driving the wagon anyway, and he was a cavalry scout during the war. Jackson considered this. If he can follow orders and keep his head, yes. Good, we'll meet at my office tonight to go over the details. The sheriff turned to go, then paused. Miss Harper's been asking about you, seemed concerned when you didn't stop by the school today. Jackson's expression remained neutral. Tell her I'm doing my job. The sheriff gave him a knowing look but said nothing more. After a solitary meal at the hotel restaurant, Jackson made his way to the sheriff's office. Peterson and the 2 county deputies were already there, solid men with the weathered look of those who'd seen their share of trouble and survived it. Jackson laid out his plan simply. The Claytons expect the wagon to come through Black Rock Pass. Instead, we'll take the longer route through the Eastern Valley. Peterson and I will drive the wagon. You 3 will ride ahead as decoys along the expected route. Won't they just attack us instead? Asked one of the deputies. They might, but you'll have the high ground and cover. Your job is to engage them briefly, then withdraw, making them think you're running back to town for help. That should draw them after you, away from the real wagon. And if they split up? Peterson asked. Then we deal with whoever follows each group. Jackson's tone made it clear he was confident in his ability to handle such a scenario. The key is timing. We need to get the wagon through before they realize they've been duped. The men discussed details for another hour: signals, rendezvous points, contingency plans. Jackson was impressed by their questions and suggestions. These weren't reckless young guns but experienced men who understood what was at stake. As they were concluding, the door opened and Vivian Harper entered, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. She stopped short at the sight of the gathering. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "I brought coffee and sandwiches. Mrs. Wilson thought you might be planning late." The sheriff welcomed her warmly. "Perfect timing, Miss Harper. We were just finishing up." The men gratefully accepted the refreshments, and Jackson found himself watching Vivian as she poured coffee with quiet efficiency. She'd pulled her hair back more severely than the previous evening, but tendrils had escaped around her face, softening her appearance. "Mr. Thornton," she said, approaching him with a cup. "I didn't see you in town today." "Scouting," he replied shortly, accepting the coffee. "And did you find what you were looking for?" Something in her direct gaze made him answer more honestly than he intended. "Yes, the Claytons are planning to ambush the wagon. We're going to make sure they fail." Concern flickered across her face. "Be careful." Roy has always been dangerous, but lately, she trailed off. Lately, there are rumors he's become erratic, violent even with his own men. She lowered her voice. "The woman who runs the boarding house near the saloon said he beat one of his men nearly to death last month for questioning his orders." Jackson filed this information away. An unstable leader made the situation more volatile but also potentially more exploitable. "We'll be ready." Vivian nodded, her expression grave. "The supplies on that wagon represent months of fundraising, but they're not worth anyone's life." Her eyes met his. "Please remember that." Before Jackson could respond, she turned to speak with Peterson about the alternate route, leaving him with an unsettled feeling. Her concern seemed personal rather than merely civic, and he wasn't sure how to interpret it or his own response to it. When the meeting broke up, Jackson found himself walking Vivian back to Mrs. Wilson's house. The night was clear, stars brilliantly visible above the modest buildings of Silver Creek. "You didn't have to escort me," Vivian said as they walked. "It's perfectly safe, with the Claytons in the area." "Better not to take chances." She accepted this with a nod. "I appreciate what you're doing for Silver Creek. These people have endured so much drought, harsh winters, isolation. They deserve some peace." "And what about you?" Jackson asked. "What do you deserve?" The question seemed to surprise her. "I have everything I need. My students, my work, good friends like Mrs. Wilson." "That's not what I asked." Vivian was silent for several steps. "What does anyone deserve, really? We make choices, live with the consequences, find purpose where we can." She glanced at him. "What about you? What does Jackson Thornton deserve?" The question struck uncomfortably close to thoughts he usually avoided. "Nothing I'm likely to get," he said finally. They reached Mrs. Wilson's gate and Vivian turned to face him. In the moonlight, her expression was solemn. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Jackson, even those of us who think we've lost the right to one." Before he could respond, she opened the gate and walked up the path to the house. At the door, she turned. "Good night, and good luck tomorrow." Jackson stood there long after the door closed behind her, her words echoing in his mind. Second chances had never been part of his calculations. Survival, justice of a sort, the next job, these were the boundaries of his existence since Emily died. The idea that he might deserve more felt both foreign and dangerous. He returned to his hotel room, checking his guns and equipment methodically, trying to focus on the task ahead rather than Vivian Harper's penetrating gaze or the way her voice softened when she spoke of her students. Tomorrow would be dangerous enough without distractions. Morning brought low clouds and the threat of rain, good conditions for their plan, as it would limit visibility and muffle sounds. Jackson met Peterson at the livery stable before dawn, where they prepared the wagon. It was smaller than Jackson had expected, loaded primarily with crates of books, school supplies, and some dry goods for the general store. "Not much to die for," Peterson commented, securing a tarp over the cargo. "Depends on your perspective," Jackson replied, thinking of Vivian's fierce pride in her school. They set out as the first light crept into the sky, taking the eastern route while the three decoys headed visibly north along the main road. If the Claytons had scouts watching the town, they would see exactly what Jackson wanted them to see. The eastern route was longer and rougher, requiring them to ford a shallow stream and navigate a rocky stretch that slowed their progress considerably. Jackson rode beside the wagon, constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit or ambush. "You sweet on Miss Harper?" Peterson asked abruptly as they climbed a particularly challenging slope. Jackson gave him a sharp look. "What? No offense meant," the older man said mildly. "Just noticed how you look at her. Been a while since anyone caught her attention too. Town's been trying to match her up for years, but she keeps everyone at arm's length." "I'm leaving as soon as this job is done," Jackson said flatly. Peterson shrugged. "Most do." "Silver Creek's not exciting enough for some." He clicked to the horses, urging them up the incline. "Shame, though. She deserves someone who'd stay." Jackson didn't reply, irritated by the conversation and his own discomfort with it. His focus needed to be on the Claytons, not on blue eyes and piano music. They were halfway to Junction City when they heard distant gunfire. Jackson reined in, listening carefully. 3 shots, then 2 more, the signal they'd arranged if the decoys made contact with the Claytons. "They've engaged," he told Peterson. "Keep moving. I'll scout ahead." Jackson urged his horse forward at a canter, climbing to a rise that offered a view of the valley below. In the distance, he could see dust rising from riders moving past the decoys with at least 6 men in pursuit. The plan was working. He returned to Peterson with the news. "Most of the gang is chasing our decoys, but we should assume at least 2 or 3 might have stayed behind or split off. Stay alert." They continued for another hour without incident, the wagon creaking over increasingly rough terrain. The rain that had threatened all morning finally began to fall, a steady drizzle that turned the trail muddy and reduced visibility. Jackson's instincts told him they were being watched, but he saw no concrete evidence. The first shot came as they rounded a bend in the trail, the bullet splintering wood near Peterson's head. Jackson reacted instantly, drawing his gun and firing at the flash he'd seen from a cluster of boulders ahead. "Get down," he shouted to Peterson, who had already ducked low on the wagon seat. 2 riders emerged from behind the rocks, firing as they charged toward the wagon. Jackson's first shot caught the lead rider in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The second man veered off, seeking cover behind a lightning-struck oak. "Stay with the wagon," Jackson ordered Peterson, dismounting and moving toward the fallen rider, keeping his gun trained on the man. It was one of the Clayton brothers, not Roy, but the younger one, Frank. He was clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers, his face contorted with pain and rage. "You're finished, Clayton," Jackson said, kicking the man's dropped pistol away. "Call your friend out before anyone else gets hurt." Frank Clayton spat on the ground. "Go to hell, Thornton." The crack of another shot came from behind the oak tree, the bullet whistling past Jackson's ear. He dove for cover behind a boulder, calculating angles and options. The second man was pinned down but had a clear shot at the wagon if Peterson moved. "Last chance," Jackson called out. "Throw out your gun and walk away with your lives." The only answer was another shot, this one striking the boulder in front of him, sending stone fragments flying. Jackson waited, listening for movement, then risked a quick glance around the edge of his cover. The second man had moved, trying to circle behind him. Jackson tracked the movement, then fired twice in rapid succession. A cry of pain told him at least one shot had found its mark. He moved quickly, using the scattered boulders as cover until he could see his opponent, a bearded man he didn't recognize, clutching his leg where Jackson's bullet had grazed him. "Drop it," Jackson ordered, his gun steady. The man hesitated, then let his pistol fall to the ground. "Clayton's gonna kill you for this," he growled. "He can try." Jackson secured both men, using leather straps from the wagon to bind their hands. Frank Clayton would need a doctor for his shoulder, but the wound wasn't life-threatening. The other man's injury was minor. What now? Peterson asked, climbing down from the wagon. "We take them with us," Jackson decided. "They might have useful information and we can't leave them here to report back to Roy." They secured the prisoners in the back of the wagon under the tarp, with Peterson keeping his shotgun trained on them while Jackson drove. The rain had intensified, turning the trail into a muddy morass that slowed their progress considerably. By mid-afternoon, they reached the halfway point to Junction City, a trading post operated by a taciturn Swede named Gustafsson. The man asked no questions when Jackson explained they needed to secure their prisoners, merely offering his root cellar as a makeshift jail. "The others should rendezvous here if all went according to plan," Jackson told Peterson once the prisoners were locked away. "Let's hope they made it." They didn't have to wait long. Within the hour, the 3 decoys arrived, muddy and tired but unharmed. Their plan had worked perfectly. They'd drawn the Claytons into a fruitless chase before losing them in the hills. "Roy was furious," reported one of the deputies with satisfaction. "Realized too late he'd been had." "He'll be more furious when he discovers his brother's been captured," Jackson said. "We need to move quickly." "The wagon continues to Junction City tonight. In this weather," Peterson looked skeptical, "trails near impassable in some places." "Which is exactly why Roy won't expect it," Jackson replied. "He'll assume we'd wait out the storm. This is our best chance to get the supplies through safely." The others agreed, though not without reservation. They rested the horses for an hour, took a hot meal at the trading post, and set out again as dusk approached, leaving the prisoners under Gustafsson's watchful eye with instructions for the sheriff to collect them. The night journey was grueling. Rain continued to fall, turning stretches of the trail into treacherous mud that threatened to mire the wagon wheels. Twice they had to stop and manually free the vehicle, everyone straining against the weight as the horses pulled. Jackson drove now, with Peterson riding alongside as guard, both men soaked to the skin and alert for any sign of pursuit. Junction City appeared finally as a cluster of lights through the rain swept darkness just before midnight. The general store owner, forewarned by telegraph of their approach, was waiting despite the hour, his warehouse open to receive the precious cargo. "Miss Harper will be mighty relieved," he said as they unloaded the crates of books and supplies. "She was certain you'd get through, Mr. Thornton. Told me so herself before you left." Jackson found himself oddly touched by Vivian's faith in him. "The job's only half done," he reminded them. "We still have to get back to Silver Creek, and Roy Clayton is going to be looking for revenge." They took rooms at the local hotel, all of them too exhausted to consider starting back immediately. Jackson slept fitfully, his dreams troubled by images of Vivian standing in the path of Clayton's bullets, reaching out to him as he failed to reach her in time. He woke before dawn, unsettled by the dreams and eager to be moving. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving a pearl-gray sky and mud-slicked streets. The deputies and Peterson were already in the hotel dining room when he came down, discussing the return journey over plates of eggs and bacon. "We'll take a different route back," Jackson told them. "Longer but less likely to be watched." The others agreed readily. They'd seen enough of Clayton's determination to understand the danger wasn't past. The wagon, now loaded with supplies for Silver Creek's general store and a few personal packages for townspeople, departed Junction City as the sun broke through the clouds. The return journey proved uneventful through the morning, their alternate route taking them well south of the areas where the Claytons typically operated. Jackson remained vigilant, but as the miles passed without incident, even he began to believe they might reach Silver Creek without further confrontation. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch by a small creek. Jackson checked their map, calculating distances and time. "We should reach town by nightfall if we push on," he told the others. Unless the sound of approaching riders interrupted him. Jackson signaled for silence, moving quickly to a position where he could see the trail while remaining hidden. 6 riders appeared around the bend, moving at a steady pace. At their head rode Roy Clayton. Jackson rejoined the others, his expression grim. "Clayton, 6 men, they're between us and Silver Creek." "How did they find us?" Peterson whispered, reaching for his rifle. "Doesn't matter now." "They have the high ground and numbers." Jackson considered their options. "We need to split up. Peterson, take the wagon and continue south with 1 deputy. Circle wide around them and make for Silver Creek. The rest of us will create a diversion." Peterson nodded, understanding the logic even as concern showed on his weather-beaten face. "Be careful, Thornton. Clayton's got a particular hatred for you now." "Good. I want him focused on me, not the wagon." Jackson checked his guns methodically. "Give us 5 minutes, then move out fast." Jackson and the 2 remaining deputies circled through the trees, emerging onto the trail about a quarter-mile ahead of Clayton's group. They positioned themselves behind rocks and fallen logs, creating a defensive position that would be difficult to rush. When Clayton's men came into view, Jackson called out, "That's far enough, Clayton." The riders pulled up sharply, hands moving to weapons. Roy Clayton's face contorted with rage when he recognized Jackson. "Thornton, where's my brother?" "Safe in custody." "Which is more than I can say for you if you don't turn around now." Clayton's laugh was harsh. 3 against 6. "Those odds favor me, gunslinger." "I've faced worse," Jackson replied calmly, though he knew their position was precarious. Every minute they kept Clayton occupied was another minute for Peterson to get the wagon safely away. "Where's the wagon?" Clayton demanded, his eyes scanning the area. "Where are the supplies?" "Long gone," Jackson lied smoothly. "Already in Silver Creek by now." Clayton's expression told Jackson he wasn't fully convinced. "Search the area," he ordered 2 of his men. "They're lying." The standoff continued for tense minutes, neither side willing to initiate the violence that seemed inevitable. Jackson knew they couldn't maintain this position indefinitely, but every minute gained was valuable. The sound of a distant gunshot from the south made Clayton's head snap around. "The wagon!" he snarled, immediately understanding the deception. "Jeb, Marcus with me." He wheeled his horse, leaving 3 men behind as he galloped toward the source of the sound. "Now!" Jackson shouted to the deputies, and they opened fire on the remaining men, forcing them to take cover. The gunfight was brief but intense. One of Clayton's men fell with a deputy's bullet in his chest. Another took a shot to the leg from Jackson before surrendering. The 3rd man fled back the way they had come. "We need to help Peterson," Jackson told the deputies, already moving toward his horse. "Clayton will be on him any minute." They rode hard, following the wagon's clear tracks in the mud. The sound of gunfire grew louder as they approached a shallow river crossing. Through the trees, Jackson could see the wagon stalled in the middle of the stream, one wheel apparently stuck between rocks. Peterson and the deputy were returning fire from behind the vehicle as Clayton and his men shot from the cover of the riverbank. Jackson assessed the situation quickly. "Circle around downstream," he ordered the deputies. "Cross and come up behind them. I'll draw their attention." Without waiting for acknowledgement, Jackson urged his horse forward, firing as he charged toward Clayton's position. The surprise of his attack created momentary confusion, allowing him to reach a large boulder that offered cover. "Clayton," he shouted, "it's over. The sheriff knows where we are. Reinforcements are on the way." "You're a dead man, Thornton," Clayton returned, firing blindly in Jackson's direction. "You and that schoolteacher both." The mention of Vivian sent a cold wave of fear through Jackson, fear that surprised him with its intensity. "This is between you and me, Clayton. Leave the town out of it." "Too late for that." Another shot pinged off the boulder near Jackson's head. "Silver Creek took everything from my family. I'm just returning the favor." Jackson risked a glance toward the wagon. Peterson had managed to free the wheel and was urging the horses forward to the far bank. The deputy provided covering fire, but one of Clayton's men was circling to cut them off. Making a split-second decision, Jackson broke from his cover, firing rapidly to force Clayton and his remaining man to duck. He sprinted toward the river, bullets kicking up mud around his feet. Reaching the water's edge, he continued firing as he waded in, the cold current tugging at his legs. Peterson saw him coming and turned the wagon to provide better cover. Jackson reached them just as Clayton's circling man appeared on the far bank. The deputy's shot caught him in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. "Go," Jackson shouted to Peterson, clambering onto the wagon. "I'll cover you." The wagon lurched forward, splashing through the remaining water and up the muddy bank. Behind them, Clayton and his last man mounted a pursuit, but their horses struggled with the crossing, giving the wagon precious seconds of lead time. Once on firmer ground, Peterson urged the team to a gallop, the wagon bouncing violently over the uneven terrain. Jackson clung to the seat with one hand, his gun ready in the other, watching for pursuit. They maintained their desperate pace for nearly an hour, the horses lathered with sweat, but gamely responding to Peterson's expert handling. Eventually, the sound of pursuit faded, and Jackson allowed himself to believe they might have escaped. "We should rejoin the main trail soon," Peterson said, his voice hoarse from shouting encouragement to the horses. "Can't keep this pace on this terrain much longer." Jackson nodded agreement. The wagon had held together remarkably well considering the punishment it had taken, but one of the wheels was making an ominous sound with each revolution. They reached the main trail as the sun was beginning to set, its golden light painting the western sky in shades of orange and pink. Silver Creek lay less than 5 miles ahead, its buildings just visible in the distance. "We made it," Peterson said with evident relief, but Jackson's instincts told him it wasn't over. Clayton won't give up that easily, he's too invested now. As if summoned by his words, riders appeared on the ridge to their right. Roy, Clayton, and 3 men, having apparently circled ahead during the pursuit. "Get down," Jackson yelled as the first shots rang out. Peterson slumped forward, a red stain spreading across his shirt. Jackson grabbed him before he could fall from the wagon, laying him in the bed while simultaneously taking the reins. The horses, panicked by the gunfire, surged forward at a dangerous pace. Jackson couldn't stop to check Peterson's condition. All his focus was on controlling the terrified team and returning fire when possible. Clayton and his men were gaining, spreading out to flank the wagon. The outskirts of Silver Creek appeared ahead, the scattered homes and small farms that surrounded the main settlement. Jackson saw people emerging from buildings, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Among them, standing in front of the schoolhouse, was Vivian. "Get inside," he shouted as the wagon thundered past, Clayton's men in close pursuit. Instead, Vivian ran toward the sheriff's office, her blue dress billowing behind her. Jackson lost sight of her as he rounded a bend in the road, entering the main street of Silver Creek. The sheriff and several townsmen were already positioned, rifles ready. They opened fire as Clayton and his men entered the town, forcing them to scatter. One man fell from his horse while another veered down a side street. Clayton himself continued the pursuit, seemingly oblivious to the danger as rage consumed him. Jackson pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the general store, jumping down to check on Peterson. The older man was pale but conscious, his breathing labored. "Got me good," he gasped. "Worth it, though. Got the supplies through." "Hold on," Jackson told him, tearing a strip from his own shirt to press against the wound. "Doc's coming." Indeed, the town doctor was already hurrying toward them, his bag in hand. Jackson left Peterson in his care, drawing his gun as he scanned the street for Clayton. A movement in his peripheral vision was his only warning. Jackson turned as Roy Clayton emerged from between 2 buildings, his gun already raised. They fired simultaneously, the sounds blending into a single thunderous report. Jackson felt the burn of a bullet grazing his side, but Clayton took the worst of the exchange. The outlaw staggered, his chest blooming red, gun falling from nerveless fingers. He dropped to his knees in the dusty street, his expression one of surprise rather than pain. "You." He began, but whatever he meant to say was lost as he toppled forward, dead before he hit the ground. The sudden silence was deafening. Jackson became aware of people emerging from buildings, of voices calling questions, of the sheriff organizing men to pursue the remaining outlaws. But all he could focus on was Vivian, running toward him with fear etched on her face. "Jackson, you're hurt." He looked down, surprised to see blood soaking his shirt. "It's nothing. Peterson's worse." But the adrenaline that had sustained him was fading, and the world tilted alarmingly. Vivian reached him just as his knees buckled, her arms somehow supporting him despite their difference in size. "Doctor," she called, lowering Jackson gently to sit on the boardwalk. "He's been shot. Just a graze," Jackson insisted, though the pain was beginning to register now. "Clayton, dead," she confirmed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as she pressed a handkerchief to his side. "The others surrendered or fled." The doctor, having stabilized Peterson, hurried over to examine Jackson. "Let's get him to my office. Bullet went clean through, he's lucky." Jackson wanted to protest that he could walk, but his body refused to cooperate. The last thing he remembered was Vivian's worried face above him, her lips forming words he couldn't hear as darkness claimed him. He woke in an unfamiliar bed, sunlight streaming through curtained windows. For a moment he couldn't place where he was, then memory returned in fragments: the wagon, the chase, Clayton's final attack. He tried to sit up and was rewarded with a sharp pain in his side. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," came Vivian's voice from nearby. She rose from a chair beside the bed, placing a book on the small table. "Doctor says you need to rest." Jackson subsided against the pillows, taking in his surroundings. He was in a small but comfortable bedroom, simply furnished with the bed, a dresser, and the chair Vivian had occupied. "Where am I?" Mrs. Wilson's house. The doctor's office was full with Peterson and 2 others wounded in the fight. Mrs. Wilson offered her spare room. Vivian poured water from a pitcher on the bedside table, helping him drink. "You've been unconscious for nearly a day." Jackson processed this information. "Peterson, he'll recover. The bullet missed anything vital." She sat on the edge of the bed, her expression softening. "You saved him, Jackson. You saved the supplies, the school, maybe the whole town." He shook his head slightly. "Just doing the job I was paid for." "We both know that's not true." Her directness, as always, caught him off guard. "Most men would have taken the money and run at the first sign of trouble. You stayed. You fought for people you barely knew." Jackson looked away, uncomfortable with her praise. "What happens now, with the Claytons gone? The town can breathe easier. Frank Clayton will stand trial for his crimes. The others who survived have already been taken to the territorial prison." She hesitated. "The sheriff says you're entitled to the reward that was posted for Roy Clayton." "It's substantial." Jackson hadn't known about any reward, but it didn't surprise him. Men like Clayton often had prices on their heads. "Good. That should help rebuild whatever was damaged in the fight." Vivian studied him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see past all his carefully constructed barriers. "The town council is meeting tonight to discuss that very thing. They've asked about you, whether you might consider staying on. Silver Creek could use a man with your skills." The suggestion caught him by surprise. Staying had never been part of his plan. 5 years of drifting had become a habit, a protection against forming attachments that could be lost as suddenly as Emily had been. "I don't put down roots," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Everyone needs roots eventually, Jackson." Vivian's hand moved as if to touch his, then withdrew. "Even those of us who think we're better off alone." Before he could respond, Mrs. Wilson appeared in the doorway with a tray of food. "Ah, you're awake. Excellent." Nothing helps healing like a good meal. The moment broken, Vivian stood and moved to help Mrs. Wilson arrange the tray. Jackson watched her, noting the graceful efficiency of her movements and the gentle way she interacted with the older woman. There was a piece about Vivian Harper that both attracted and unsettled him, a centeredness he'd lost when Emily died. Over the next 3 days, Jackson's strength gradually returned. The doctor pronounced his wound healing well, though he cautioned against strenuous activity for at least another week. Confined to Mrs. Wilson's house, Jackson found himself drawn into the rhythm of their household breakfast with Sally before she left for school. Quiet afternoons reading books Vivian brought him. Evenings spent in conversation around the parlor fire. On the fourth evening, Vivian returned from school with exciting news. The books arrived from Junction City today. The children were overjoyed. Her face was animated with pleasure. I wish you could have seen their faces, Jackson. For some of them, these are the first new books they've ever held. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Jackson found himself smiling in response. I'm glad they arrived safely. Worth all the trouble, then. More than worth it. She sat in her usual chair across from him, her cheeks still flushed from the brisk autumn air. James Whittaker, the boy who wants to be a doctor, he couldn't stop looking at the anatomy text. Said he's going to read it cover to cover before the month is out. Jackson watched her as she described other students' reactions, struck by how thoroughly she invested herself in their aspirations. You really believe in them, don't you? That they can become whatever they set their minds to? Of course. She looked surprised at the question. Every child deserves the chance to dream beyond the circumstances of their birth. Education is the key that unlocks those possibilities. And what about your dreams, Vivian? The question emerged before he could consider its implications. Is teaching in Silver Creek all you want from life? She was silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. When I came here, I had no dreams left. My fiancé was dead, my family devastated by the war. Teaching was simply something I could do something useful. She looked into the fire. But these children, they gave me purpose again, a reason to look forward rather than back. But is it enough? Jackson pressed, not entirely sure why her answer mattered to him. Vivian met his gaze directly. Is drifting from town to town, taking dangerous jobs enough for you? The question hit with uncomfortable precision. Jackson had never considered his nomadic existence in terms of sufficiency. It was simply survival, penance perhaps for failing to save Emily. I had a wife, he said abruptly, the words surprising him as much as they clearly surprised Vivian. Emily. She died 5 years ago. Fever took her while I was away on a job. The familiar pain tightened his chest. I should have been there. Understanding dawned in Vivian's eyes. And you've been punishing yourself ever since. Jackson looked away, unable to bear the compassion in her gaze. Moving on is easier than staying where the memories are. Is it? Her voice was gentle. Or does running just mean you carry the pain with you everywhere, never setting it down long enough to heal? The insight struck too close to home. Jackson stood abruptly, ignoring the twinge in his side. I should check on my horse. Been confined too long. He escaped to the stable behind Mrs. Wilson's house, where his stallion greeted him with a soft nickering. The familiar routine of brushing the animal and checking his hooves calmed Jackson's unsettled emotions, but Vivian's words continued to echo in his mind. Had he been running? The question had never occurred to him in quite those terms. He told himself he was doing what he was good at, using his skills in ways that occasionally helped people like the citizens of Silver Creek. But facing Vivian's direct assessment forced him to consider the possibility that his wandering had been less about purpose and more about avoidance. He was still mulling this over when the stable door opened and Vivian entered, carrying a lantern against the gathering dusk. Mrs. Wilson was worried, she explained, setting the lantern on a nearby shelf. It's getting cold out here. Jackson continued brushing his horse, not meeting her eyes. I'm fine. Used to worse conditions than this. Vivian moved closer, reaching out to stroke the stallion's nose. The horse, usually wary with strangers, leaned into her touch. He's beautiful. What's his name? Shadow, Jackson replied, watching his normally aloof mount respond to her gentle attention. Fitting. She smiled slightly. Strong and reliable, I imagine, like his owner. Jackson snorted. Stubborn and temperamental, more like that too. Her smile widened briefly before fading into seriousness. I'm sorry if I overstepped earlier. Your grief is your own, and I had no right to judge how you've handled it." The apology surprised him. "You didn't overstep, you just saw more than most people bother to." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the rhythmic brushing of the horse and its occasional soft snorting. "I lost my fiancé at Gettysburg," Vivian said finally. "Robert. We were to be married when he returned." Her voice was steady, though Jackson could hear the old pain beneath it. "For the first year I could barely function. Every morning, waking up to remember all over again was agony." Jackson's hand stilled on Shadow's flank. "What changed, a child?" "I was teaching at a small school in Pennsylvania. There was a boy, Jimmy, who'd lost his father in the same battle. One day, he brought me a drawing he'd made of his father in heaven, watching over him." She smiled at the memory. "He said his mother told him that those we love never really leave us. They live on in how we choose to honor their memory." Jackson considered this. "And teaching was how you honored Robert. Living fully was how I honored him," she corrected gently. "Robert loved life, every aspect of it. To retreat into grief would have betrayed everything he stood for." She looked directly at Jackson. "I don't know your Emily, but I doubt she would want you to spend your life alone, moving from place to place, never allowing yourself to form connections." The truth of her words struck him with physical force. Emily had been vibrant, full of laughter and plans for their future. She'd dreamed of children, a home filled with love. His current existence would have horrified her. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted, the confession painful but somehow liberating. "Running's become a habit." Vivian's hand touched his arm lightly. "By planting your feet somewhere, by taking a risk on belonging again." "Here." The question encompassed more than just Silver Creek. It encompassed the possibility of a life that included Vivian Harper, with her quiet strength and unflinching honesty. "Why not here?" She met his gaze steadily. "The town needs you. The sheriff is getting older, and there's talk of appointing a deputy who could eventually take over." She hesitated. "And there are people here who care whether you stay or go." The implication hung between them, neither quite ready to put it into words. Jackson found himself wanting to believe it was possible that he could set down the burden of his solitary existence and build something new here. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Vivian nodded, accepting this as enough for now. "Supper will be ready soon. Mrs. Wilson made apple pie." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Jackson, I think you've been carrying your grief long enough. Perhaps it's time to see what lies on the other side of it." She left him with those words, the lantern casting her shadow long across the stable floor before disappearing into the darkness beyond. The next few days passed in a strange limbo for Jackson. His wound healed rapidly, and with his returning strength came the familiar restlessness that had driven him from town to town for years. Yet something held him in Silver Creek, something beyond his physical recovery. He began taking short walks through the town, nodding to citizens who now greeted him by name. The general store owner insisted on giving him supplies at no charge. The blacksmith offered to shoe Shadow whenever needed. Even the saloon owner, typically taciturn with strangers, welcomed him warmly. These small gestures of acceptance bothered Jackson in ways he couldn't articulate. He'd spent years deliberately avoiding such connections, knowing they came with expectations he wasn't prepared to meet. Yet here in Silver Creek, he found himself responding despite his better judgment. A week after the confrontation with Clayton, the sheriff approached Jackson as he was exercising Shadow in the small paddock behind Mrs. Wilson's house. "Good to see you back on your feet, Thornton," the older man said, leaning against the fence. "Doc says you're healing well." Jackson nodded. "Well enough to travel soon." The sheriff's expression turned thoughtful. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. Town council met last night. They've authorized me to offer you a position deputy sheriff with the understanding you'd take over when I retire next year." Though Vivian had mentioned this possibility, the formal offer still caught Jackson off guard. "Why me? You hardly know me." "I know enough. I've been sheriff here for 20 years. I can judge a man's character." The sheriff shifted, his gaze direct. You stood up for this town when you had no reason to. You put yourself between our people and danger without hesitation. That tells me all I need to know. Jackson ran a hand over Shadow's neck, buying time to gather his thoughts. I appreciate the offer, Sheriff. But I've never stayed in one place long, not sure I'd be any good at it. Maybe it's time to find out. The sheriff straightened. Pays not much, but there's a small house that comes with the job previous deputy's place. It needs some work, but it's solid. Think about it. He turned to go, then added, Oh, and Miss Harper asked me to tell you she'd like you to visit the school tomorrow. Something about showing the children a real hero. Jackson grimaced. I'm no hero. The sheriff's smile was knowing. Tell that to 28 children who got new books because of you. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Jackson with yet another decision to make. That evening, he found himself walking past the small house the sheriff had mentioned. It stood on a quiet street near the edge of town, a simple structure with a front porch and a yard that needed attention. Jackson stood looking at it for a long time, trying to imagine himself living there, becoming part of this community. The image refused to form clearly. 5 years of transience had left him unable to picture permanence. Yet when he tried to envision riding away from Silver Creek from Vivian, that image was equally blurred and unsatisfying. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps approaching. Vivian appeared beside him, a shawl pulled around her shoulders against the evening chill. It's a good house, she said, following his gaze. Nathan Jenkins, the previous deputy, raised 3 children there before moving to California last year. The sheriff told you about his offer, Jackson stated. She nodded. He thought I might be able to persuade you to accept. And can you? The question emerged more sharply than he intended. Vivian was quiet for a moment. I wouldn't try to persuade you to do something that wasn't right for you, Jackson. The decision has to be yours. She paused. But I would tell you that this town values what you did, that the children ask about you every day, that Mrs. Wilson would miss your presence at her table. And you. The words escaped before he could reconsider them. Would you miss me, Vivian? She turned to face him fully, the fading light casting her features in soft shadow. Yes, she said simply. I would miss you very much. The admission hung between them, neither willing to be the first to define exactly what it meant. Jackson found himself at a crossroads that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the heart he'd believed died with Emily. I don't know if I can be what this town needs, he said finally. What you need. Perhaps the question is what you need, Jackson. Her voice was gentle but insistent. After 5 years of running, what would make you want to stay? The answer came to him with surprising clarity. Something worth staying for. Vivian's expression softened. And have you found that here? Jackson looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the quiet strength in her face, the intelligence in her eyes, the compassion that radiated from her like warmth from a fire on a cold night. In that moment, he knew with certainty that riding away from Silver Creek would be the greatest mistake of his life. I think I might have, he said quietly. Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the plains, gradual but transformative. Then perhaps you should see that house in the daylight before you decide. Perhaps I should, he agreed, feeling something shift inside him, something that had been locked tight since Emily's death beginning to open, allowing light to enter places long kept dark. They walked back toward Mrs. Wilson's in companionable silence, not touching but somehow more connected than if they had been. At the gate, Vivian turned to him once more. Will you come to the school tomorrow? The children really do want to meet you. Jackson had faced gunmen, outlaws, and natural disasters without flinching, but the prospect of 28 children regarding him as some kind of hero filled him with trepidation. Yet he found himself nodding. What time? After lunch, around 1 o'clock. Her smile widened. Don't worry. They won't bite. The next day, Jackson approached the schoolhouse with uncharacteristic nervousness. He'd taken extra care with his appearance, wearing his cleanest shirt and even trimming his beard. As he mounted the steps, he heard the buzz of young voices inside, then Vivian's calm tones calling for order. He hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain. What did he know about children? What could he possibly say that would matter to them? Before he could retreat, the door opened and Vivian stood there, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "You came. Children, our special visitor is here." 28 pairs of eyes turned toward him as he entered, some curious, some shy, all expectant. Jackson removed his hat, feeling distinctly out of place amidst the neat rows of desks and educational charts on the walls. "Class, this is Mr. Jackson Thornton," Vivian introduced him. "As I told you, he's the brave man who helped bring your new books safely to Silver Creek." A small boy in the front row raised his hand. "Did you really shoot bad Clayton, sir, James?" Vivian admonished, though her lips twitched with suppressed amusement. Jackson cleared his throat. "I did what needed doing to protect the town," he said carefully. "But that's not something to admire, son. Violence is sometimes necessary, but never something to seek out." The boy James, the aspiring doctor, considered this seriously. "My pa says sometimes a man has to fight for what's right." "Your pa's a wise man," Jackson acknowledged. "But fighting isn't always with guns. Sometimes the bravest fights are the ones Miss Harper wages every day, fighting ignorance with knowledge, fighting hardship with perseverance." The children looked between their teacher and the tall stranger, processing this perspective. A girl with braided blonde hair raised her hand next. "Are you staying in Silver Creek, Mr. Thornton?" The question was innocent but struck at the heart of Jackson's internal struggle. He glanced at Vivian, finding her watching him with an expression that carefully revealed nothing of her own hopes. "I'm considering it," he said honestly. "Silver Creek seems like a good place to call home." The girl nodded, satisfied. "We need a new sheriff soon." "Old Sheriff Parker falls asleep sometimes." This prompted giggles from the other children and a gentle rebuke from Vivian. The ice broken, Jackson found himself fielding questions about his horse, his travels, and yes, his gunfight with Roy Clayton, though he carefully emphasized the consequences rather than any perceived glory in the confrontation. As the afternoon progressed, Jackson relaxed, surprisingly comfortable with these curious young minds. He found himself telling them about the different territories he'd visited, the diverse peoples he'd encountered, the natural wonders he'd seen. Their eager questions and absorbed expressions reminded him of the wonder he himself had once felt about the world, a wonder that years of grief and solitude had nearly extinguished. When the school day ended, the children filed out with reluctance, many stopping to thank Jackson for coming. James Whittaker lingered last, clutching his precious anatomy book. "Miss Harper says you got shot protecting our supplies," he said solemnly. "Does it hurt still?" Jackson shook his head. "Nearly healed now." The boy nodded, his expression serious beyond his years. "When I'm a doctor, I'll be able to help people who get hurt like that, fix them up proper." "I believe you will," Jackson told him, surprised by how genuinely he meant it. "Study hard." James grinned suddenly, the serious demeanor giving way to boyish enthusiasm. "I will, sir, every day." He dashed off, joining his friends outside. Alone with Vivian in the classroom, Jackson found himself unexpectedly moved by the experience. "They're good kids." "The best," she agreed, gathering papers from her desk. "What did you think of James?" "He's the one I told you about, up at 4 every morning to help his family before school. Determined. Reminds me of someone else I know." Jackson smiled slightly, watching her organize her materials with practiced efficiency. Vivian glanced up, catching his gaze. "Thank you for coming today." "It meant a lot to them and to me." "I enjoyed it more than I expected to," he admitted. "They ask good questions. Children usually do." She hesitated. "Especially that last one about whether you're staying." Jackson moved to help her stack the readers that needed to be returned to the shelf. "I went to look at that house this morning, the deputy's place. And," her voice was carefully neutral, but he could hear the underlying tension, "needs work. Roof leaks in one corner, porch steps are rotting." He shelved the last book before turning to face her. "But it has good bones." could be made into a real home with some effort. Hope flickered in her eyes. Does that mean you're considering the sheriff's offer? I'm considering more than that, Vivian. The words came easier than he'd anticipated. I'm considering putting down roots here. Making a life that's about more than just surviving from one day to the next. What changed your mind? She asked softly. Jackson took a deep breath. You did. This town did. Those children. He gestured toward the empty classroom. 5 years ago, when I lost Emily, I thought that part of my life was over. The part where I belonged somewhere, cared about people, let them care about me. He met her gaze directly. I was wrong. Vivian's expression softened. It takes courage to admit that. It takes courage to start over, he countered. Something you know about, she nodded, acknowledging the parallel in their experiences. It isn't easy. There are days when grief still catches me unaware, but it gets better. And having purpose, having people who matter to you makes all the difference. I'm beginning to understand that. Jackson moved closer to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes. Vivian, I can't promise I'll be good at staying in one place, at being part of a community. But I'd like to try if there's a reason to try. The implication was clear. Vivian's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't look away. I think there might be several reasons. The children, the town, Sheriff Parker's retirement, and… Jackson prompted, his heart beating faster than it had during any gunfight. And me, she said simply. If that matters to you, it matters more than I can say. He took her hand, the contact sending warmth spreading through him. I never expected to feel this way again after Emily. Never wanted to risk it, but you make me want to take that risk. Vivian's fingers tightened around his. I felt the same way after Robert died, as if loving again would somehow dishonor his memory. But I've come to believe that the best way to honor those we've lost is to live fully, to embrace the chance for happiness when it comes. And has it come, Vivian, that chance? Jackson hardly dared to breathe as he waited for her answer. I believe it has. Her smile was both shy and certain. If you're willing to find out where it leads. In answer, Jackson bent his head and kissed her gently at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. It felt both familiar and entirely new, this connection with another heart that understood loss and had found its way back to hope. When they finally separated, Vivian's eyes were bright with emotion. Does this mean you'll accept the sheriff's offer? Jackson smiled, the expression feeling strange but right on his face. I think it does, on one condition, which is that the schoolteacher agrees to help the new deputy fix up that leaky roof and rotting porch. I hear she's good at organizing community projects. Vivian laughed, the sound warming places in Jackson's heart he'd thought permanently cold. I think that can be arranged. The children would love to help too, especially if there's a chance to hear more of your stories. I'll have to find some suitable ones, he mused. Most of my experiences aren't fit for young ears. You'll have time to collect new ones, she assured him. Better ones, I hope. Jackson drew her close again, marveling at how right it felt to hold her. I believe I will. The following Sunday, Jackson officially accepted the position of Deputy Sheriff of Silver Creek. The announcement was made after church services, met with approval from the townspeople who had come to regard him as one of their own in the short time since the confrontation with the Claytons. That afternoon, a dozen volunteers showed up at the small house that would become his home, armed with tools, lumber, and determined expressions. Peterson, recovered enough to supervise if not work, directed operations from a chair on the lawn while Mrs. Wilson organized a group of women providing food and refreshments. Jackson found himself working alongside men who just weeks earlier had been strangers, their easy camaraderie making the labor feel less like a chore and more like a celebration. Vivian moved between groups, her organizational skills keeping everyone productive and supplied with lemonade from Mrs. Wilson's kitchen. By sunset, the porch had been rebuilt, the roof patched, and plans made for painting the exterior the following weekend. As the volunteers departed, Jackson stood in what would soon be his front yard, watching the setting sun paint the modest house in shades of gold. "It's starting to look like a home," Vivian said, coming to stand beside him. Jackson put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "It's starting to feel like one too." In the weeks that followed, Jackson settled into his role as deputy with surprising ease. The skills that had kept him alive as a drifter served him well in maintaining order in Silver Creek. His reputation alone deterred most potential troublemakers, and those who tested him quickly learned that his calm demeanor masked a resolute commitment to justice. His relationship with Vivian blossomed alongside his integration into the community. They took things slowly, both respectful of the losses they had survived and the new beginning they were crafting together. Sunday afternoons became their special time walks along the creek, picnics when weather permitted, quiet conversations about their pasts and their hopes for the future. As Christmas approached, Jackson found himself contemplating a step he would have considered unthinkable just months earlier. The realization that he wanted to propose to Vivian came not as a revelation, but as a natural progression, the logical next chapter in a story that had begun with reluctant heroism and evolved into profound connection. He visited the town's jeweler, a German immigrant named Hoffman who had once been a master craftsman in his homeland. The old man listened carefully to Jackson's halting description of what he wanted, then nodded with understanding. "For Miss Harper, yes, something elegant but not ostentatious. She is a lady of substance, not flash." He sketched quickly on a pad, showing Jackson a design for a ring that perfectly captured Vivian's essence, a sapphire surrounded by smaller diamonds, set in silver rather than gold. "This will complement her eyes and her spirit, I think." Jackson agreed, though the price made him wince. Still, the reward money from Clayton's capture had been substantial, and what better use for it than this symbol of his commitment to a future he once thought impossible. On Christmas Eve, Silver Creek's church was filled to capacity for the children's pageant. Jackson sat with Sheriff Parker and his wife, watching as Vivian directed her students through the nativity story with patience and enthusiasm. Even James Whittaker, normally serious beyond his years, seemed caught up in the festive spirit as he performed his role as one of the wise men. After the performance, the town gathered in the church hall for refreshments and the exchange of small gifts. Jackson watched Vivian move through the crowd, accepting congratulations on the pageant's success with gracious modesty. The sight of her cheeks flushed with happiness, eyes bright with pride in her students confirmed what he already knew. He wanted to build a life with this woman who had shown him the way back from grief to hope. As the evening wound down, Jackson approached Vivian, who was helping Mrs. Wilson pack leftover cookies for distribution to families in need. "Could I walk you home?" he asked, suddenly nervous in a way no gunfight had ever made him. Vivian smiled, noting his unusual tension. "Of course, just let me finish here." The night was clear and cold, stars brilliantly visible above the quiet streets of Silver Creek. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the small bridge that crossed the creek near the edge of town. Jackson stopped, drawing Vivian to face the water, where moonlight danced on the gently flowing surface. "Remember when I first came to town?" he asked, his voice low in the stillness. "When you asked me to help protect the wagon," she nodded, her expression curious. "Of course. You were determined to leave as soon as the job was done. I had been running for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere." He took both her hands in his. "You changed that, Vivian. You made me want to stay not just in Silver Creek, but in life itself. To be present again, to care, to love." Her breath caught at the last word, her eyes widening with understanding of where this conversation was leading. "I never thought I would love again after Emily," Jackson continued, his voice rough with emotion. "But you showed me that the heart can heal, can grow large enough to honor what was lost while embracing what's been found." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing the small box Hoffman had given him that morning. "I love you, Vivian Harper." Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled in her eyes as he opened the box, revealing the sapphire ring that caught the moonlight like a captured star. "Oh, Jackson," she whispered, "it's beautiful. Is that a yes?" He asked, suddenly uncertain despite the emotion clear on her face. In answer, she threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking him off balance. "Yes," she laughed through her tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Jackson held her close, his heart fuller than he had believed possible. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, he marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment from a lonely drifter, determined to avoid connections, to a man embracing love and community with his whole being. "Merry Christmas, Vivian," he murmured against her hair. "Merry Christmas, Jackson," she replied, lifting her face for his kiss. "The first of many we'll share together." They were married in the spring when wildflowers carpeted the plains surrounding Silver Creek. The entire town turned out for the wedding, the church overflowing with well-wishers. James Whittaker proudly served as ring-bearer, his serious demeanor momentarily transformed by the importance of his role. As Jackson stood at the altar watching Vivian walk toward him in a gown of ivory silk, her face radiant beneath a veil of delicate lace, he felt Emily's presence not as a ghost haunting him but as a blessing. He could almost hear her voice, "Be happy, Jackson. Love her well." And he intended to, not just for the years they would share, but for each day, each moment. Vivian had taught him that life wasn't measured in grand gestures but in daily choices to remain present, to give of oneself, to trust in possibilities rather than dwell in past sorrows. When they exchanged vows, Jackson's voice was steady and sure. The promises he made to love, honor, and cherish Vivian all the days of his life were not merely words, but commitments from a heart that had found its way back from desolation to hope. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. Jackson, never much of a dancer, found himself willingly led onto the makeshift dance floor by his new wife, her happiness making him forget his usual self-consciousness. "Sheriff Thornton," she teased as they moved to the music. "Who would have thought the lone gunslinger would end up leading Silver Creek's first waltz?" Jackson smiled, holding her close. "Sheriff Parker has another year before retirement." "But everyone knows you'll be taking over," she countered. "The children already call you sheriff when they see you on your rounds." "And what do they call you?" he asked, spinning her gently. "The same as always, Miss Harper, though I suppose they'll have to get used to Mrs. Thornton now." Her eyes sparkled with happiness. "It might take some adjustment for all of us." "Worth it, though?" he asked, suddenly needing the reassurance that she had no regrets. Vivian's expression softened. "More than worth it, my love, every moment." Later that night, alone in the house they now shared, its roof no longer leaking, its porch solid and welcoming, Jackson held his wife close, marveling at the turn his life had taken. "I came to Silver Creek with nothing but a reputation and a heart I thought was dead," he told her as they lay in the darkness. "Now I have everything I never dared hope for." Vivian pressed closer to him, her head resting on his shoulder. "We both do, a second chance at happiness. A future to build together." "I love you, Vivian Thornton," he whispered, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue. "And I love you, Jackson Thornton," she replied, "forever and always." As sleep claimed them, Jackson reflected on the journey that had brought him to this place of peace. He had been a man who believed love was behind him, that his heart was capable only of surviving, not thriving. Vivian had shown him otherwise, had reawakened possibilities he thought forever lost. She was the one who made him believe in love again, and the cowboy had returned to believe not just in love, but in life itself, with all its challenges and joys. In finding her, he had also found his way home.